On a misty night in 1888, in a crime-ridden London neighborhood called Whitechapel, there were screams, and the cause of those screams overshadowed all the other crimes in Whitechapel. The cause of these screams was a killer named Jack the Ripper. Crime was rampant in the Whitechapel neighborhood. Men were involved in crime, and many of the women made a living as prostitutes. It was inevitable that many of the victims would be prostitutes. In England at the time, the literacy rate of the people was increasing, and the people who heard about the murders in the newspapers were alarmed, even though they gathered to catch the murderer, but nothing came out. Jack the Ripper is perhaps the most famous killer in the world. But to what does he owe this fame? Why did he stand out from all the others and become almost a legend? Before examining all this, it would be a good start to look at the sociological situation in England at the time. In the dark side of London, where there was an industrializing state and an enriching society, things were not going so well. British people who migrated from the countryside to the city to find work had a lot of trouble adapting and became residents of the muddy London streets. In such a chaotic environment, crime rates inevitably skyrocketed, and crime became a part of life. In this situation, many of the women in the city became prostitutes. Thousands of letters were received by newspapers and police stations at the time of the murders, but there is no evidence of their authenticity. Only 3 letters stand out among thousands of letters. These are Dear Booze, Saucy Jackie, from Hell. On October 7, 1888, George R. Sims of the Sunday newspaper sarcastically claimed that the letters were written by a journalist to increase the circulation of the newspaper. Police officers later announced that they had identified the writer of Dear Boss and Saucy Jack as a journalist. In 1913, Detective John Littlechild identified a journalist named Tom Bullen as the author of the letters, and reportedly, another journalist named Fred Best and a colleague from the Star newspaper confessed to writing letters signed Jack the Ripper to keep the news in the news and increase circulation. Now that we understand a little bit about the period, it is time to look at the individual murders, but there is no exact number of victims. Maybe there are many more than what we have described here, but we will look at the 5 generally accepted murders. But don't forget to like and subscribe before watching the rest of the video. First victim murder on August 31, 1888, at around 3 a.m. Mary Ann Nichols was found in an alley known as Bucks Row, now Head Street. Her body had been mutilated in an extremely brutal manner. Her chest had been split open and her neck cut. When the authorities arrived, it turned out that the victim had been murdered half an hour earlier, so when the body was first discovered, the killer was somewhere very close by. The depth and evenness of the cuts gave the impression that the killer had surgical knowledge. This murder became a spectacle of violence, considered to be Jack the Ripper's signature crime. Mary Ann Nichols was the Ripper's first victim, and her murder made the public very uneasy. It was a kind of prototype for the other murders that were to follow. There were many observant witnesses to Nichols' murder, but the killer left no trace. Second, victim murder Annie Chapman was murdered in a courtyard in Hanbury Street on September 8, 1888. Around 6 p.m., her body was again brutally mutilated. In this murder, the killer clearly had more experience than in the previous murder. In particular, the cuts on Chapman's abdomen were very deep, and her uterus was removed. Once again, the killer's surgical knowledge stood out. Third, victim murder on September 30, 1888. Elizabeth Stride was found dead in Dutfield's yard during the night. This murder was slightly different from the others because Stride's throat was slit, but her body was not further mutilated. Some theories suggest that Stride's killing was interrupted and the killer moved on to someone else. This murder reinforced the view of some that Jack the Ripper killed 2 different victims in the same night. After Stride's murder, the killer is thought to have sped away and was looking for a new victim. This shows how fast and deliberate the Ripper was in his killings. 4. Fourth victim murder, Catherine Edos, was found on September 30, 1888, 1 hour after Stride's body was discovered. Edos' body was found in Mitre Square immediately after Stride's murder. This murder was much more violent than the previous murders. Edos' neck had been cut, but there was also a very deep cut to the abdomen. The killer had reached into Edos' abdominal cavity and removed her uterus. Her body was also rendered quite unrecognizable. Examination of Edos' body revealed more traces of one of Ripper's signature murders. This murder was another example that proved the killer had specific surgical knowledge. In addition, the fact that Edos' wallet and some of her belongings were missing shows that this was no ordinary killing, but rather the psychological satisfaction the killer derived from dismembering his victims. Fifth victim, Mary Jane Kelly, was Jack the Ripper's last victim. Born in 1863, Kelly became a prostitute at a young age and settled in Whitechapel. Murder. On November 9, 1888, Mary Jane Kelly was found murdered. Kelly's murder was far more gruesome than Ripper's other murders. Kelly's body was dismembered. In a state of chaos, her genitals had been cut off, her abdomen completely opened, and her internal organs pulled out. Her face was unrecognizable. This murder is considered to be Jack the Ripper's most brutal and gruesome. Kelly's murder shows that the killer is now acting in a completely uncontrolled manner. The horror of this murder, unlike the Ripper's previous murders, created a much greater sense of dread. Kelly's murder also shows that Jack the Ripper used a form of violence that had never been seen before. The murders of these 5 victims have gone down in history as part of Jack the Ripper's gruesome journey. Each murder has left its mark, attracting the attention of the public and the police force, and generating many theories trying to understand. What kind of state of mind was behind these murders? Almost nothing is known about Jack the Ripper's physical characteristics, but according to the claims of some eyewitnesses, he is said to be 25 to 35 years old, 165 centimeters to 170 centimeters tall, with a mustache, white skin. The police speculate that since he was so skillful in his crimes, he was most likely a doctor or a butcher. After learning about the poor victims, let's try to find the answer to everyone's question: which psychopathic serial killer committed these murders? But the sad news is that 137 years later, the killer is still unknown. We will still examine the possible suspects, and even some of them will make you say, this is the killer for sure. First suspect, Montague John Druitt, was one of the first prominent suspects in the Jack the Ripper investigation. Born in 1857, Druitt was an educated individual. He was a lawyer as well as a teacher. His family, especially his mother, had suffered from mental health problems, and this was considered remarkable in terms of his psychological background. The main reason for Druitt's association with Jack the Ripper was the discovery of his body. In the River Thames in late 1888, on November 30th, 1888, Druitt was abruptly dismissed from his teaching position, and a few weeks later, on December 3rd, he was found dead in the river. Police records suggested suicide. Interestingly, Druitt disappeared shortly after the last murder, that of Mary Jane Kelly. Second suspect, Aaron Kosminski, was a Jewish immigrant, born in Poland around 1865. He settled with his family in the Whitechapel area of London in the 1880s. Kosminski was recorded as a low-income individual who worked as a barber. According to police reports of the period, he suffered from mental disorders and had aggressive behavior. He was especially known to hate prostitutes. He also had an almost identical physical appearance. In the recent book naming Jack the Ripper, Russell Edwards claims that a shawl purchased at an auction contained Kosminski's DNA. The shawl was purchased because it was found at the murder scene of the 4th victim, Catherine Edos. Edwards then enlists the help of a biologist who explains that the blood is linked to Edos. It is also claimed that the sperm found in the shawl is linked to Kosminski's relatives. With this evidence, many people claim that Jack the Ripper has been found. But Edwards and his defenders were frustrated because it turned out that the scientist who helped Edwards may have made a naming mistake. In a nutshell, the scientist discovered a mutation in the shawl and in a relative of Edos. It was a very rare mutation, and he thought the evidence matched, but it turned out that there had been a mistake in the identification. It turned out that the mutation was found in 90% of people of European descent. If this DNA was correct, the killer could be anyone 90% of the time. It turned out that a pinpoint piece of evidence actually proved nothing. In short, the evidence that supposedly revealed the killer turned into evidence that meant nothing. According to some claims, Jack the Ripper was actually a woman, because the letters that were sent indicated that he was a man. The police thought that the killer was male and had a perverted mentality. Then he was searched everywhere as a man, so there is some suspicion that he may have walked past the police while all the teams were looking for him as a man. But these claims are disproved when eyewitnesses repeatedly say they saw a man. Third suspect, James Maybrick, born in 1838, was a wealthy Liverpool cotton merchant. In 1889, his name was made famous in the case of his wife Florence's alleged arsenic poisoning death. However, the claim that Maybrick could be the Ripper came to the fore with the documents called Maybrick Diary that emerged in the 1990s. The diary was presented as Maybrick's own handwritten confession to the murders. The diary contained details about all the victims, including Mary Jane Kelly, although similar in many ways. The diary was considered a forgery by many experts. Third, Walter Sickert was a famous British painter who lived in the early 20th century. He was 28 years old at the time of the murders. A writer named Patricia Cornwell claims that Sickert may have been Ripper. Cornwell said that some of the letters were similar to the papers used by Sickert, and that he had placed some elements from the murders in his paintings. There is even a work called Jack the Ripper's Bedroom. There were also those who said that Sickert dressed like Jack and walked around. Although he said he was in France at the time of the murders, Cornwell's research disproved this. He was in London for at least 3 of the murders. Some experts have compared Sickert's letters with the 3 we mentioned earlier, and found that they all used a special kind of paper. But the reason they're not considered evidence is because it's not clear whether they're real or not. And maybe Sickert sent all the letters because he obviously admired Jack the Ripper. And so none of this was accepted as evidence. Fifth suspect. Karl Feigenbaum was a German sailor. He was executed for the murder of an old woman in New York in 1894. His lawyer, William Lawton, claimed that his client might have been Jack the Ripper. Feigenbaum was reported to have been in many port cities around the world and to have shown psychopathic tendencies. Some researchers have focused on the possibility that Feigenbaum was in London at the time of the murders. However, there is no clear record of this. Sixth suspect. Joseph Barnett was Mary Jane Kelly's lover. The couple had separated shortly before the murder. The theory that Barnett may have been the Ripper is based on a motivation of jealousy. With the exception of Kelly, all of the victims were street prostitutes, and it is suggested that Barnett tried to make money to lure Kelly away from this life and even killed other women for this reason. However, when he became unemployed, Kelly went back to being a prostitute, and the two eventually had a fight, and Barnett left the house after. This incident, and Kelly was found dead 10 days later. For these reasons, Barnett was thought to be the murderer. It was even thought that because he was Kelly's friend, he met other prostitutes and thus killed them more easily. And although he was questioned by the police, no serious evidence was found against him. However, the fact that the murders ended with Kelly's death strengthened this theory for some. Yes, everyone, we have come to the end of our video. Who do you think is actually the killer? Please do not forget to specify in the comments, and you can also correct me if I have any mistakes. Don't forget to subscribe and like the videos.